The sun, a fiery orange ball sinking below the horizon, cast long, dancing shadows across the still surface of Willow Creek Lake. A gentle breeze whispered through the tall pines, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. David, his fishing rod a familiar extension of his arm, felt a familiar calm settle over him as he watched the ripples spread from his line. It was his sanctuary, the quiet corner of the world where the relentless pressures of life seemed to melt away. He loved the gentle tug on the line, the suspense of what might be lurking beneath the water, but more than that, he cherished the peace. He closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the cool air, a contented sigh escaping his lips. Then, a shrill, piercing voice shattered the tranquility. "Well, well, well, if it isn't our resident rebel." David opened his eyes, a tiny frown creasing his brow. Brenda, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair shining even in the fading light, stood a few feet away, hands on her hips, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. Her eyes, usually narrowed in suspicion, gleamed with an almost giddy self-satisfaction. Two other women, members of her inner HOA circle, stood slightly behind her, their expressions a mix of grim satisfaction and barely concealed excitement. They looked like a flock of well-dressed vultures circling their prey. "Brenda," David said, his voice calm, though a ripple of annoyance stirred within him. He reeled in his line slowly, making sure not to spook whatever was nibbling at his bait. He knew this dance. Brenda had made it her personal mission to ensure no one enjoyed Willow Creek Lake as much as he did, especially if it meant breaking one of her unwritten yet vehemently enforced rules. "Still at it, I see," she purred, taking a step closer. The other women exchanged knowing glances, a silent conversation passing between them. "Despite our very clear guidelines, despite the numerous notices, despite the verbal warnings," she paused dramatically, letting the words hang in the air like a heavy curtain. "I believe Section 4, Subsection B, Paragraph 7 of the HOA bylaws explicitly states, 'No recreational fishing permitted within Willow Creek community property, including all bodies of water.'" She beamed, as if she had just recited the Magna Carta. David sighed. He had read the bylaws thoroughly. There was no such clause. He'd even consulted a lawyer, just to be sure. This was Brenda's personal crusade, fueled by a desire for control and a deep-seated aversion to anyone enjoying themselves on her watch. "Brenda, we've been over this," David began, choosing his words carefully. "That section doesn't exist, and even if it did, the lake isn't technically HOA property. It's listed as—" Brenda cut him off, her voice rising in pitch, her face beginning to flush. "Oh, it exists, Mr. Peterson, and it is absolutely HOA property, a critical aesthetic feature maintained by our dues for the enjoyment of all residents, which does not include disturbing the natural ecosystem with your unsightly fishing practices." She gestured wildly at his fishing rod, as if it were a weapon of mass destruction. "You are in direct violation. This time, the board has authorized immediate action. A fine. A substantial fine. And if you persist—" She leaned in conspiratorially, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "We will involve local authorities. Trespassing, Mr. Peterson. Think about that." Her triumph was palpable, a sickly sweet scent of victory wafting off her. The other two women nodded vigorously, their smiles wide and unyielding. They thought they had him. They believed they had won. David looked at her, then at the lake, its surface now reflecting the deep blues and purples of twilight. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. He looked back at Brenda, his eyes meeting hers, and a calm, resolute certainty settled over him. "You know, Brenda," David said, his voice soft, almost a murmur against the encroaching night. He slowly lowered his fishing rod, letting the line slacken. "There won't be any fines, and there won't be any trespassing charges." Brenda's smug expression wavered, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. What are you talking about, Mr. Peterson? Are you denying the rules? This is precisely why we have to be so strict. Your defiance is an affront to— Because, David interrupted, his voice gaining a quiet strength that made Brenda falter, her words dying in her throat. You can't trespass on your own property. He took a deep breath, the evening air filling his lungs. And Brenda, I just bought the entire lake. The words hung in the air, heavier than any silence David had ever experienced. Brenda's mouth, which had been open to deliver another stinging rebuke, snapped shut with an audible click. Her eyes, usually so sharp and judgmental, widened, growing round as saucers. The color drained from her face, leaving it ashen, her carefully applied makeup suddenly stark against her pallor. The two women behind her stared, their initial smiles dissolving into expressions of stunned disbelief. A faint, distant croak of a frog was the only sound for what felt like an eternity. David simply stood there, a quiet, almost serene smile on his face, the fishing rod still in his hand, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery hues behind him. The air crackled with unspoken questions, with the shattering of Brenda's carefully constructed world. Life in Willow Creek started as a dream, a tranquil escape from the hustle and bustle that David had grown accustomed to over his decades in a demanding career. He had spent years toiling away, building a successful but ultimately exhausting life, where every day was a race against the clock, and the only constant was the hum of city traffic. When he finally decided to step back, to embrace a quieter pace, Willow Creek had seemed like the perfect haven. He found a charming single-story house, nestled among mature trees, with a spacious backyard that promised future gardening projects. The community was advertised as peaceful, family-friendly, and replete with natural beauty. He had envisioned long, lazy afternoons, the scent of blooming flowers, and the gentle rhythm of small-town life. From the moment he unpacked his last box, David had found solace in the simple things. He started his days with a cup of coffee on his porch, listening to the birds chirp their morning greetings. He took leisurely walks around the neighborhood, admiring the well-kept lawns and the variety of architectural styles. He was a man who appreciated order and beauty, but not at the expense of warmth or genuine connection. He was quick with a smile, ready to lend a hand, and genuinely interested in learning about his new neighbors. He believed in community, in the idea that people living close to each other should strive for harmony and mutual support. He saw the world through a lens of quiet optimism, always looking for the good, always ready to extend a helping hand. His passion, a lifelong love affair, was fishing. It wasn't about the size of the catch or the thrill of the fight. It was about the ritual, the connection to nature, the meditative stillness of casting a line into unknown depths. He'd spent countless weekends as a boy by his grandfather's side, learning not just how to bait a hook, but how to read the water, how to be patient, how to appreciate the vast, silent world beneath the surface. It was a heritage, a calming presence in his life that always brought him back to himself. The moment he'd seen Willow Creek Lake, glistening like a jewel at the heart of the community, he knew he'd found his personal slice of heaven. It was bigger than he expected, stretching out with reeds and cattails along its edges, and a scattering of lily pads near the shallower parts. He could almost feel the presence of fish, the quiet thrum of aquatic life beneath its surface. It was idyllic, a perfect place to unwind and reconnect with his oldest hobby. He'd bought a new, lightweight fishing setup, a tackle box gleaming with new lures and lines, and a comfortable folding chair. His first few excursions to the lake were pure bliss. He found a secluded spot under a weeping willow tree, its branches dipping gracefully towards the water, offering perfect shade. He would sit for hours, sometimes catching a small bass, sometimes nothing at all, but always feeling renewed. The gentle lapping of the water against the shore, the distant calls of waterfowl, the soft rustle of leaves, it all conspired to create a perfect symphony of peace. He'd wave to the occasional dog walker or jogger, sharing a friendly nod, feeling truly at home. He even saw a couple of kids peering wistfully at the water, holding makeshift fishing poles fashioned from sticks and string, their eyes alight with curiosity. He smiled, remembering his own childhood fascination. David was not one to rock the boat, figuratively or literally. He understood that living in a community, especially one with an HOA, meant adhering to certain guidelines. He made sure his lawn was neatly trimmed, his hedges were manicured, and his trash bins were out of sight on non-collection days. He even volunteered to help a new neighbor, an elderly woman named Clara, move some heavy boxes into her garage when she first arrived. Clara, a kind woman with bright, inquisitive eyes and a penchant for baking, quickly became a friendly face, often sharing stories of her own past adventures and offering David a slice of her delicious apple pie. She was one of the few people in the community who seemed to genuinely embody the spirit of neighborliness, a refreshing contrast to the more rigid atmosphere that occasionally seemed to settle over Willow Creek. His initial interactions with the HOA were standard. He received a welcome packet, thick with rules and regulations. He attended the first community meeting, a somewhat dry affair where budgets were discussed and minor grievances aired. It was there he first encountered Brenda. She wasn't just a board member. She seemed to be the board, her voice dominating discussions, her pronouncements delivered with an air of absolute authority. She meticulously detailed every perceived infraction in the community, from mismatched mailbox flags to slightly overgrown rose bushes. She seemed to thrive on order, but her definition of order left little room for spontaneity or individual expression. She was the self-appointed guardian of Willow Creek's pristine image, and she took her role with a seriousness that bordered on the obsessive. David observed her, noting her sharp gaze, her tendency to interrupt, and the way she would narrow her eyes when anyone dared to question her. He tried to introduce himself after the meeting, offering a friendly hand, but she merely gave him a curt nod and a dismissive glance before turning to address another homeowner about their porch light. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible brush-off, but it left a faint chill in the air. Over the next few weeks, David received a polite but firm letter regarding a minor discrepancy in the color of his window trim, which apparently deviated from the approved shade of colonial white. He dutifully repainted it. Then came a notice about the height of his grass, which was 1/4 of an inch over the permissible limit after a particularly rainy week. He mowed it again. He understood the need for standards, but he also felt a growing sense of the absurd. It seemed as though every aspect of life in Willow Creek was micromanaged, every blade of grass, every flicker of light. It was a subtle, creeping feeling of being watched, of constantly being judged by an unseen, all-seeing eye. His fishing trips, however, remained his secret defiance, his quiet rebellion. He rarely saw anyone else at his preferred spot, and he always cleaned up after himself, leaving no trace. He had even, on a whim, brought a small bag of breadcrumbs one afternoon and tossed a few into the water, watching as tiny fish darted to the surface, their mouths opening and closing in quick succession. He felt a surge of pure, uncomplicated joy. He noticed that the fish in the lake seemed to be thriving, darting through the clear water, healthy and vibrant. It reaffirmed his belief that his presence, far from harming the ecosystem, was simply a part of the natural rhythm. One breezy Tuesday afternoon, as David sat by the lake, the setting sun painting the sky in soft pastels, he saw a young boy, no older than 10, cautiously approach the shore further down. The boy, carrying a small, flimsy fishing rod made of a stick and a piece of twine, looked around furtively, as if expecting to be caught. He was thin, with worried eyes, and his clothes looked well worn. He reminded David of himself as a child, full of an innocent wonder for the natural world. The boy cast his line, a twig tied to the end acting as a makeshift bobber, and waited with bated breath. David smiled, a warm feeling spreading through his chest. It was a small, almost invisible act of rebellion against the unspoken rules of Willow Creek, a moment of pure, unadulterated joy that resonated deeply with David. He watched the boy for a few minutes, enjoying the shared, silent camaraderie. Suddenly, a sharp voice cut through the quiet. "Hey, you! What do you think you're doing?" It was Brenda. She emerged from behind a cluster of bushes, seemingly materializing out of thin air, like a vengeful fairy godmother, her stride purposeful and her expression stern. The boy jumped, startled, his makeshift rod clattering to the ground. His face, which had been alight with hopeful anticipation, crumpled into a mask of fear. "Didn't you see the signs?" Brenda demanded, pointing to a small, almost hidden placard that read, "No swimming, no boating, no fishing." The sign was so small, so discreetly placed, David himself had only noticed it after living there for months. "This is private property, HOA rules. You are not permitted to disturb the peace or the wildlife. Now pick up your trash and leave immediately." The boy's eyes welled up with tears. He fumbled for his rod, his hands trembling. I wasn't hurting anything, ma'am. I just wanted to—" "No excuses," Brenda barked, her voice echoing across the water. "Rules are rules. If I see you here again, I will call your parents and the authorities. Do you understand?" The boy, tears streaming down his face, mumbled a terrified, "Yes, ma'am," and scrambled away, disappearing into the trees, leaving behind a small, broken twig that had once been his fishing rod. David felt a surge of anger, hot and unexpected, rise within him. It wasn't just the boy's distress, but the sheer cruelty of Brenda's rigid enforcement, her complete lack of empathy. It was a small act, but it felt like a violation of the spirit of community, a dismissal of the simple joys of childhood. He wanted to say something, anything, but Brenda was already turning away, a satisfied smirk on her face, as if she had just saved the community from a grave peril. She didn't even glance his way. That night, David couldn't sleep. The image of the terrified boy, the broken twig, and Brenda's triumphant sneer replayed in his mind. He looked out his window at the dark outline of the trees, beyond which lay Willow Creek Lake, now silent and imposing. He thought about the peace the lake brought him, the simple pleasure of a quiet afternoon. He also thought about the joy it could bring to others, especially children, if only they were allowed. The HOA, or rather Brenda, had turned a beautiful natural resource into a personal fiefdom, a symbol of petty tyranny. This wasn't just about his fishing anymore. It was about the spirit of the community, about kindness, and about the fundamental right to enjoy what was supposed to be a shared amenity. A quiet resolve began to harden within him, a determination to do something, anything, to challenge this oppressive control. He wasn't sure what that would be, but he knew he couldn't stand by and watch Brenda turn their beautiful community into a playground for her own power trips. He closed his eyes, the lake calling to him, a silent challenge in the darkness. He would find a way. He had to. The next morning, David woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in a long time. The incidents with the lawn, the window trim, the almost hidden no fishing sign, and especially the terrified boy, all coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. Brenda was not just an overly zealous HOA president. She was a bully, using her position to control and intimidate. David had always preferred to avoid conflict, to find peaceful solutions, but this was different. This was about more than just his personal enjoyment. It was about the collective spirit of the community, the quiet desperation he'd seen in the eyes of other residents who seemed to walk on eggshells around Brenda. He realized that polite compliance wasn't going to work. Brenda understood only one language: authority. And if she wielded it arbitrarily, then perhaps it was time for someone else to wield a different kind of authority. He spent the morning researching. He delved deep into local property records, mapping out the precise boundaries of Willow Creek community. He looked up deeds, zoning laws, and water rights. What he discovered was both surprising and infuriating. While the community owned the land around the lake itself, historically, had been part of a much larger private estate that had been broken up and sold off over the decades. The developer who built Willow Creek had acquired the surrounding land, but, for reasons lost to time or perhaps shrewd negotiation, had never actually purchased the lakebed itself. It was owned by a separate, almost forgotten entity, a private trust, a very old private trust. This explained why the HOA's claim to the lake was always vague, why the no fishing sign was so small, so easily missed. They were bluffing. They didn't own it. David's research led him down a rabbit hole of historical documents, legal filings, and obscure land titles. He spent hours on the phone with county clerks, poring over microfiches, and even drove to the county seat to look at original plat maps. He learned that the trust was managed by a single, increasingly elderly lawyer in a neighboring state, and that the beneficiaries were distant relatives who had no interest in the property, viewing it as a long-forgotten, minor asset. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Finch, sounded surprised when David contacted him. "Willow Creek Lake?" Mr. Finch had mused, his voice raspy with age. "Ah, yes, that old thing. Been in the family for generations, though none of them have ever bothered with it. Just sits there, collecting property taxes. Dreadful nuisance, honestly." David's heart pounded with a nascent idea, a daring, audacious plan that felt both utterly ridiculous and brilliantly logical. He started quietly, subtly, without drawing any attention. He contacted a real estate agent specializing in unique properties, explaining his interest in a large, undeveloped water body in a specific area. He made inquiries about property values, about the legalities of owning a lake, about potential liabilities. He worked discreetly, using a different email address, making calls from a burner phone he bought for this purpose, not wanting any of his initial inquiries to be traced back to his Willow Creek address. He felt a thrill, a clandestine excitement, like a spy on a secret mission. This was a battle for the soul of his new community, and he was ready to fight it with intellect and resources, not petty arguments. He learned that the lake, despite its apparent size and central location, was considered a landlocked and underperforming asset by the trust. It generated no income, only expenses in the form of property tax. Brenda's jaw, which had hung slack in utter disbelief, snapped shut with a harsh click. Her face, drained of color moments before, began to flush a deep, angry red. Her eyes, still wide with shock, quickly narrowed into furious slits, burning with a mixture of outrage and betrayal. She took a trembling step forward, her perfectly manicured hands clenching into tight fists at her sides. The quiet calm of the evening air which had settled over Willow Creek Lake suddenly felt charged, thick with the thunderous silence before a storm. You bought the lake?" Brenda finally hissed, the words barely a whisper, as if merely speaking them would lend them an impossible reality. Her voice was thin, raspy, completely stripped of its usual commanding tone. It sounded like a child caught in a lie. One of her companions, a woman named Carol, who usually mirrored Brenda's every expression, let out a small, bewildered gasp. The other, Nancy, simply stared, her mouth slightly ajar, as if she couldn't process the sounds entering her ears. The truth David had just delivered was a meteorite, crashing directly into the carefully constructed world of rules and regulations that Brenda had so meticulously built around herself. David met her gaze, his own eyes calm and steady. A gentle breeze ruffled his hair, and the faint scent of pine needles drifted past. He felt a quiet satisfaction, not of triumph over a defeated enemy, but of a quiet justice unfolding. "Yes, Brenda," he confirmed, his voice soft but firm, leaving no room for doubt. "The entire lake, all the water and the land beneath it. As of yesterday afternoon, Willow Creek Lake is my private property." He gestured casually towards the vast expanse of shimmering water, as if indicating a newly acquired garden gnome. Brenda's face contorted, twisting through a rapid succession of emotions: disbelief, fury, humiliation, and finally, a simmering rage. This is preposterous, unacceptable. You can't just buy a lake. Not our lake. It's part of the community. It belongs to the homeowners. It's a shared amenity. Her voice began to rise with each frantic question, regaining its usual volume, but now laced with a desperate, hysterical edge. She stomped her foot, a surprisingly childish gesture given her usual composed demeanor. Who would even sell a lake? This is a trick, a blatant lie. You're trying to circumvent the rules. This is exactly the kind of rogue behavior we explicitly prohibit in Willow Creek. Carol, looking distinctly uncomfortable, cautiously stepped forward. Brenda, maybe we should just listen. Mr. Peterson wouldn't just say something like that. Nonsense, Carol, Brenda shrieked, whirling on her, her eyes blazing. He's trying to manipulate us, to undermine everything we've built here. Don't you see? This is an attack on the very fabric of our community. A rogue homeowner taking matters into his own hands, defying the board, buying communal property. It's scandalous. She turned back to David, her finger jabbing accusingly in the air. You have no right. This is fraud. We will investigate. We will expose this. The HOA has legal counsel, Mr. Peterson. You will be hearing from them. David remained unperturbed, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He knew this outburst was inevitable. Brenda's identity was so intertwined with her control over the HOA that this felt like a personal assault on her very being. Brenda, there's nothing to investigate, he stated simply, his voice cutting through her tirade with surprising clarity. The transaction was completely legal. The lake was never actually HOA property. It was owned by a private trust. I purchased it from them, fair and square. The deed is filed with the county. It's public record. He didn't elaborate on why the HOA didn't own it, or the long history of the trust, leaving those details for her to uncover or to stew over. The less information he gave, the more she would flounder in her own confusion. This revelation, so calmly delivered, hit Brenda like a physical blow. Her shoulders slumped slightly. The very idea that her HOA, the supreme authority, had been operating under a false premise about such a central feature of the community was almost too much for her to bear. Her eyes darted from David to the lake, then back to him, a flicker of genuine fear now mingling with her rage. A private trust? She muttered, her voice barely audible, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. But we've always been responsible for its upkeep. We've pruned the trees around it, put up signs, conducted water quality tests. Her mind was racing, trying to find a loophole, a rule, anything to grasp onto and regain control. And for that I thank you, David replied, a hint of something almost like pity in his voice. You've certainly helped maintain my property, and now, as the legal owner, I'll be happy to take over those responsibilities. You can cease all expenditures related to the lake, effective immediately. He picked up his fishing rod, reeling in his line with a calm, practiced motion. The small fish he had nearly caught had long since darted away. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to enjoy my lake. He gave her a small, polite nod, then turned and began to walk away, leaving Brenda, Carol, and Nancy standing by the shore, frozen in the encroaching twilight. Brenda stood absolutely still, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her face a mask of utter devastation. She looked as though someone had just pulled the rug out from under her entire world. The power had been stripped from her, not through argument or defiance, but through an undeniable, utterly unexpected act of ownership. The other two women finally exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of the seismic shift that had just occurred. As David disappeared from view, Brenda finally let out a frustrated, guttural cry, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury and humiliation that echoed across the darkening water. The news, like ripples from a stone dropped in the lake, began to spread through Willow Creek community with astonishing speed. Whispers turned into hushed conversations, then into excited speculation. Over morning coffees, across garden fences, and during dog walks, everyone was talking about David Peterson and the lake. Some residents were outright disbelieving, scoffing at the notion that a single homeowner could simply buy the community's centerpiece. Others were cautiously optimistic, a flicker of hope in their eyes at the thought of the HOA's iron grip loosening, even if just a little. A few, the ones who had endured Brenda's overbearing reign the longest, even allowed themselves a small, private smile of satisfaction. David, meanwhile, found a newfound sense of peace. He continued his daily fishing routine, but now with a completely different mindset. He no longer felt like he was sneaking around or defying an arbitrary rule. He was simply enjoying his own property. The lake, now truly his, felt even more serene, more personal. He spent hours just sitting by the shore, sometimes casting a line, sometimes simply observing the ducks glide across the water or the tiny dragonflies zipping through the air. He noticed the subtle changes in the light, the different sounds of the birds throughout the day, the way the wind whispered through the tall grass. He also saw more people, cautiously approaching the water's edge, their faces filled with curiosity. One afternoon, as he was packing up his gear, a young woman named Sarah, who lived a few houses down, approached him. She had a shy smile and held the hand of a little girl, maybe 6 years old, with bright, curious eyes. "Mr. Peterson?" Sarah asked tentatively. Is it true? About the lake?" David smiled kindly. "Yes, Sarah. It's true. It's mine now." Sarah's eyes widened. "Wow. My daughter, Lily, she just loves the water. She's always wanted to try fishing, but, well, you know." She gestured vaguely in the direction of the HOA office. David's gaze softened as he looked at Lily, whose eyes were fixed on his fishing rod with an almost desperate longing. He remembered the little boy with the twig rod. "Well, Lily," he said, crouching down to her level. "Now you can." He pulled out a small, brightly colored bobber from his tackle box, one he'd bought years ago and never used. "Here," he offered, placing it gently in her tiny palm. "This is a good start, and if you ever want to learn how to really fish, just let me know." Lily's face lit up, a wide, radiant smile stretching from ear to ear. She clutched the bobber like it was a priceless treasure. "Really?" she squealed, looking up at her mom. "Really?" David confirmed. Sarah, her eyes glistening slightly, thanked him profusely. As they walked away, he heard Lily excitedly planning her first fishing trip with her mom, already imagining the big fish she would catch. It was a small moment, but it filled David with a warmth far greater than any prize catch. This was why he had done it, not to assert dominance, but to restore access, to share the joy. Brenda, however, was in a state of barely contained fury. She had spent the days since David's bombshell in a frenzy of activity. She had demanded an emergency HOA board meeting, her voice tight with suppressed rage, her face pale with indignation. The other board members, initially stunned by David's revelation, were now a mix of bewilderment and quiet concern. They had always trusted Brenda's judgment, her meticulous adherence to rules, but this was unprecedented. They pulled out every document, every historical record, every archived memo. They contacted their legal counsel, a large firm that handled most of the HOA's affairs. Their voices strained with urgency. Their initial findings were a devastating blow to Brenda's authority. David was right. The lake had indeed been owned by a private trust. The previous HOA boards, for decades, had simply assumed it was community property, or had been intentionally misled by the original developer who hadn't properly transferred the deed. The signs, the minimal upkeep, the rules about its use, all based on an assumption, a long-held myth. The legal counsel confirmed David's ownership, noting the deed was filed correctly and the sale was legitimate. Brenda's face had gone from red to purple, then back to a sickly green during this revelation. Her furious assertions that it was our lake were now revealed as nothing more than bluster. Humiliated but undeterred, Brenda retreated to her house, locking herself away for days, fueled by stale coffee and a burning desire for retribution. She felt personally affronted, publicly shamed. She had been the undisputed queen of Willow Creek, and David Peterson, a quiet, unassuming man, had dared to dethrone her. She couldn't let this stand. She pored over property law, nuisance statutes, environmental regulations, anything she could find that might give her an angle. She called every HOA board member daily, her voice a desperate, urgent whisper, trying to rally them, but they were hesitant, wary of another public embarrassment. They just wanted this unprecedented, embarrassing situation to quietly resolve itself. Her initial strategy, to simply deny David's claim, had failed spectacularly. Now, she needed a new plan, something insidious, something that would leverage her remaining power, however diminished. She couldn't argue against legal ownership, but she could argue against how David chose to use his newfound property. If he was going to be a thorn in her side, she would make sure he was pricked at every turn. She began collecting complaints, however minor, from residents who were either genuinely concerned or easily swayed by her influence. She focused on anything that could be construed as a nuisance or a safety hazard. David, aware of the quiet rumblings and the sudden chill he felt from some of Brenda's loyalists, maintained his calm demeanor. He started receiving anonymous letters, usually typed, sometimes with crude drawings of him as a villain, accusing him of being selfish or destroying community spirit. He simply tossed them into the recycling bin. He knew Brenda was behind it, or at least encouraging it. He knew she wouldn't give up easily. He knew this was just the calm before the next storm. One sunny afternoon, a few weeks after David's revelation, he found a thick envelope tucked into his mailbox. It wasn't a standard HOA newsletter. It was a formal, intimidating document, stamped with a stern-looking HOA logo and the words, "Urgent, Official Summons." His brows furrowed as he opened it. Inside, it wasn't just a letter. It was a multi-page dossier, meticulously compiled, filled with printed photos, official-looking citations, and a summons to an emergency community-wide meeting. The document alleged multiple new violations, not just fishing, but claims of unauthorized modifications to natural habitat, for the few handfuls of breadcrumbs he'd tossed to the fish, potential contamination of community water sources from his fishing bait, and even a vague accusation of disturbing the peace with unapproved recreational activities on private property adjacent to communal land. The most alarming accusation, however, was a claim of creating an attractive nuisance leading to potential public safety hazards. This referred to the increased presence of children and other residents near the lake, lured by the newfound possibility of fishing. Brenda's document even included grainy, zoomed-in photos of Lily and Sarah, along with several other children, peering at the lake, their faces full of innocent curiosity. The document ended with a dire warning: if David did not cease all disruptive activities and agree to negotiate the community's access and regulations within 2 weeks, the HOA, represented by their legal counsel, would initiate a lawsuit against him, seeking an injunction to restrict his use of the lake, and potentially demanding compensation for damages to community harmony and property value. The tone was cold, formal, and utterly relentless. It was clear Brenda had spent weeks gathering her forces, preparing her next offensive. This wasn't a petty squabble anymore. This was a full-blown legal assault, designed to reclaim her control, or at least make David's life in Willow Creek utterly miserable. David looked at the official stamp, the detailed accusations, the veiled threats of legal action. The peace of his afternoon shattered, replaced by a cold knot of apprehension. Brenda was coming for him with everything she had, and this time she was aiming for a direct, legal knockout. The thick, intimidating document felt heavy in David's hands, its legalistic language stark against the fading sunlight. Brenda's signature, stark and precise at the bottom of the summons, seemed to mock him. This wasn't a warning. It was a declaration of war. The knots of apprehension tightened in his stomach. He wasn't afraid of a fight, but he preferred peaceful solutions, and this felt far from peaceful. The thought of lawyers, courtrooms, and endless legal battles all over a lake he now rightfully owned was profoundly disheartening. He envisioned Brenda, sitting in her meticulously organized office, reveling in the power of this official assault. He carried the document inside, placing it on his kitchen counter. The carefully compiled accusations, complete with grainy photos of children near his lake, stung him. Brenda wasn't just trying to control him, she was trying to demonize him, to turn the community against him by painting him as a danger. The attractive nuisance clause particularly grated on him. It felt like a direct attack on the very kindness and openness he hoped to foster around the lake. He walked over to his window, looking out at the darkened expanse of water, now hidden beneath the cloak of night. It felt bigger, more formidable, a silent challenge awaiting his response. He knew he couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything. The next morning, David scheduled an immediate meeting with his own lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Sarah Davies, whom he had used for his house purchase. He laid out the entire story, from Brenda's initial harassment to the dramatic lake purchase, and finally, to the threatening HOA summons. Sarah listened intently, her expression unreadable as she reviewed the thick packet Brenda had sent. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful frown on her face. "This is something else, Mr. Peterson," she finally said, a hint of amusement in her voice that quickly faded into seriousness. "Brenda, or Ms. Hammond, as she's apparently known, is clearly very, very unhappy. This isn't about property rights anymore. It's about control and a bruised ego. She's trying to leverage fear and community pressure." Sarah tapped a finger on the attractive nuisance clause. This is their primary angle. They're trying to say that by allowing access, or simply by owning it and making it more appealing, you're creating a magnet for risk and therefore liable for any incidents. It's a common tactic when they can't challenge direct ownership. "So, what do I do?" David asked, feeling a surge of determination. "I'm not going to fence off the lake. I bought it so people could enjoy it, not so I could turn it into a fortress." Sarah nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "Exactly. And that's your strength. We're not just going to defend against this. We're going to counter. Your purchase was perfectly legal. Their claims are tenuous, based on fear-mongering and outdated bylaws. We'll attend this community meeting, of course, but it won't be just you versus Brenda. I'll be there, and we'll make our case. We'll remind the community of the truth." Over the next few days, David prepared. He compiled his own documents, the legitimate deed to the lake, and the historical records proving the HOA never owned it. He felt a sense of purpose beyond simply protecting his property. He was fighting for the spirit of Willow Creek. He knew many residents felt stifled by Brenda's rigid rules, and this was an opportunity to show them that there was another way, a more open, empathetic approach to community living. He spoke to Clara, his elderly neighbor, who, upon hearing of the HOA's latest maneuver, offered him a batch of her famous oatmeal cookies and a stern nod. "Brenda's gone too far this time, dear," she'd said, her eyes sparkling with indignation. "That lake has been here longer than any of us, and it belongs to everyone, in spirit if not on paper." Clara promised to be at the meeting, a silent, comforting presence. The night of the community meeting arrived, thick with tension. The usual meeting room in the community center was packed, far more so than usual. Residents spilled out into the hallway, eager to witness the unfolding drama. A palpable buzz filled the air, a mixture of anticipation, anxiety, and plain old curiosity. David entered with Sarah, both dressed conservatively, exuding quiet confidence. As they walked to the front of the room, David could feel the eyes of every single resident on him, a silent judgment from some, a curious gaze from others. He saw Clara in the second row, offering him a small, encouraging wave. Brenda was already at the podium, her usual imposing figure amplified by the gravity of the situation. Her face was grim, her voice strained but sharp as she began her address. She didn't acknowledge David's presence directly, but every word, every accusation, was clearly aimed at him. She painted a vivid picture of Willow Creek under siege. The lake, once a pristine reflection of their perfect community, now a dangerous, unregulated free-for-all. She spoke of unforeseen liabilities, of children falling into the water, of diseases from uncontrolled wildlife, of declining property values due to the chaos. She used fear as her weapon, trying to turn neighbor against neighbor, painting David as a rogue element, a selfish individual threatening their collective peace and prosperity. She presented a slideshow, complete with magnified versions of the grainy photos of children near the lake. "These are our children, ladies and gentlemen," she declared, her voice rising to a crescendo. "Our most precious asset, lured to danger by a complete disregard for safety and community standards. This is not just about fishing. This is about protecting our way of life." Her words were designed to inflame, to evoke panic, to consolidate her power by creating a common enemy. Many residents shifted uncomfortably, their faces etched with concern. Some whispered among themselves, swayed by Brenda's dramatic presentation. David watched her, a mix of sadness and resolve in his eyes. He knew he had to cut through her fear-mongering with logic, and more importantly, with empathy. Finally, after a lengthy, impassioned speech, Brenda opened the floor for questions, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of righteous indignation and quiet triumph. The room fell silent, the tension almost unbearable. This was David's moment. Sarah nudged him gently, a silent signal. David stood, and the entire room turned to face him. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He began by acknowledging Brenda's concerns, validating them, but subtly shifting the narrative. "I understand Ms. Hammond's concerns about safety," he began, his voice clear and steady, carrying easily across the hushed room. "And I want to assure everyone here that safety is paramount. We all care about our children and our community." He paused, letting his words sink in, establishing a common ground that Brenda had tried to erase. "But let's be clear about a few things." He then calmly laid out the facts of his purchase, detailing the legal findings that the HOA never owned the lake. He explained that he had simply acquired a piece of property that had, for decades, been mistakenly assumed to be communal. He showed copies of his deed, displayed on a projector screen, undeniable proof of his ownership. He explained that his goal was not to create chaos or danger, but to share the beauty of Willow Creek Lake in a way that was responsible and inclusive. He spoke about his love for fishing, a simple, peaceful hobby, and his desire for children to experience the joy of nature. He specifically mentioned the boy with the twig rod and Lily, the little girl with the bobber, without naming them directly, weaving a story of innocence and simple joys. "My intention is not to defy the community," David said, his voice imbued with genuine warmth. "It's to ensure that this beautiful lake, now under my stewardship, can be enjoyed by everyone, safely and responsibly. I plan to put up clear, highly visible safety signs. I'm looking into installing life preservers at various points around the lake, easily accessible. I even want to explore the possibility of free supervised fishing clinics for children during the summer if there's interest." A murmur went through the crowd, a mix of surprise and cautious optimism. David's calm, factual presentation, coupled with his unexpected offers of community engagement, was a stark contrast to Brenda's aggressive rhetoric. He wasn't just defending himself, he was offering a vision, a positive alternative. He wasn't just stating his rights, he was proposing a pathway to shared enjoyment. Just as David was about to finish, a resident from the back of the room, a man named Robert, who usually avoided any conflict, stood up. "Mr. Peterson, with all due respect, what Ms. Hammond said about attractive nuisance. Aren't you worried about liability? If someone gets hurt on your lake, even if they're trespassing, you could still be sued. The HOA can be sued even if it's not their fault. It's a very real concern for us, as homeowners whose dues might go towards defending such a lawsuit if the HOA decided to go that route with you." Brenda seized on this, a triumphant glint in her eyes. "Precisely," she interjected, pointing at Robert. "Exactly the point. Mr. Peterson is putting all of us at risk. Our insurance premiums, our financial stability. We cannot allow this reckless behavior." David turned to Robert, a calm smile on his face. "That's a very valid concern, Robert, and I appreciate you raising it," he acknowledged, refusing to be drawn into Brenda's renewed attack. "And it's one I've already addressed. Before I finalized the purchase, I secured comprehensive liability insurance for the lake property, specifically designed to cover recreational use, including fishing. It's a robust policy, well beyond what's typically required, to ensure that neither I nor, by extension, the community, would be at financial risk from accidents on the lake. My intention is to be a responsible owner, not a negligent one." He then turned back to the room, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the residents. "The bottom line is this," David concluded, his voice resonating with sincerity. "Willow Creek Lake is now privately owned. My ownership is undisputed. I am committed to making it a safe, enjoyable space for everyone, and I'm taking all necessary steps to ensure that. My door is always open to discuss ideas for safety and community use, provided they are reasonable and respectful of private property." He then stepped back, allowing Sarah to take the floor, ready to answer any legal questions. Brenda, however, was not finished. She had expected a meek defense, a desperate plea. She had not anticipated David's calm, prepared counter-arguments, his positive proposals, and especially the news about the insurance. She had counted on fear to win the day. But the room was no longer completely with her. A noticeable shift had occurred, a quiet murmur of relief and even admiration for David's thoughtful approach. She saw the wavering support, felt her grip on the room slipping. Her face, still flushed with anger, hardened into a mask of cold fury. This wasn't just about winning the immediate battle. It was about destroying David's credibility, making an example of him. She had to escalate now, before she lost everything. "Mr. Peterson," Brenda's voice cut through the slight stir in the room, sharper and colder than before, "your private ownership is noted. However, Willow Creek community has a covenant, an easement, for the maintenance of aesthetic harmony throughout the entire development. This includes the lake, and this HOA, representing the homeowners, has the right to ensure that the beauty of our community is not compromised by private activities. We have received numerous complaints, even if unverified, about new creatures in the lake. And we've also noticed, Mr. Peterson, a significant increase in the presence of what appear to be large, rather unsightly ducks and other waterfowl near your property, attracted by feeding. This, we believe, constitutes a significant disruption to the peaceful enjoyment of other properties and a potential health hazard." David frowned, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Ducks? He hadn't thought about that. He had indeed seen a few more ducks recently, and yes, he had occasionally tossed some of his leftover bread to them. It was a minor thing, a natural consequence of the lake being more accessible. But Brenda, with her typical flair for exaggeration, was turning it into a monstrous environmental crisis. This was a new, unexpected angle, a low blow. Brenda continued, her voice gaining strength as she found a new target. "Furthermore, the HOA has voted, in a special emergency session, to enforce a seldom used, but perfectly valid, noise ordinance. Specifically, a bylaw concerning excessive and prolonged outdoor recreational noise, which can be interpreted broadly to include any sound deemed disruptive to neighborhood peace. We have received initial complaints about increased splashing, excited shouting, and even what some residents describe as loud, uncontrolled laughter coming from the lake area. And while we understand the joy that children experience, Mr. Peterson, we cannot have the tranquility of Willow Creek compromised by constant, unpredictable noise from your private enterprise. She paused for dramatic effect, her eyes gleaming. Therefore effective immediately. If these activities persist, and if the waterfowl issue is not addressed, the HOA will issue fines, substantial fines, for each documented instance of noise and each documented instance of new, unapproved wildlife presence. These fines will be levied daily, and we will continue to pursue legal action based on the attractive nuisance and disruption to community harmony clauses. Consider this your final warning, Mr. Peterson. The HOA will not tolerate any disruption to the peace and quiet of Willow Creek. We will ensure our residents' right to tranquility is protected, no matter the cost. The room was suddenly silent again, but this time with a different kind of tension. The initial relief had evaporated, replaced by a fresh wave of concern. Fines. Daily fines. And legal action. Brenda's words were a cold, calculated assault, aiming to make David's ownership of the lake a financial and social nightmare. She had found a new creative way to leverage the HOA's power, turning simple acts of nature and human enjoyment into punishable offenses. David stared at her, his initial surprise giving way to a hardening resolve. This wasn't just about property rights, it was now about a fundamental clash of values. He felt the weight of Brenda's renewed assault, but also a growing determination not to let her extinguish the light of joy and freedom he had hoped to bring to Willow Creek. Brenda's final words, delivered with a chilling precision, echoed in the stunned silence of the community meeting room. The threat of daily fines, the ominous mention of new, unapproved wildlife, and the relentless pursuit of legal action based on disruption to community harmony hung in the air like a suffocating fog. This wasn't just a nuisance claim. It was a full-scale legal and financial siege, designed to make David's life a living misery until he either relented or left Willow Creek. He felt the collective gaze of the room, a mixture of sympathy, fear, and a palpable sense of anxiety about their own financial burdens if this escalated. David stood his ground, a knot of quiet fury tightening in his chest. His surprise at Brenda's pivot to ducks and laughter quickly morphed into steely determination. She had found a new battlefield, one where she believed she could still wield her considerable power. He looked at her, standing tall and unyielding at the podium, her face set in a mask of righteous indignation. He knew this wasn't about actual noise or rogue waterfowl. It was about crushing his spirit, about reasserting her absolute authority over Willow Creek. He had to respond, not just for himself, but for the quiet hope he had ignited in others. The meeting adjourned in a flurry of hushed conversations and hurried exits. Residents scattered, some avoiding eye contact, others offering quick, apologetic glances. Clara, however, walked directly over to David, her eyes sparkling with indignation. "Don't you fret, David," she whispered, her voice surprisingly firm for such a small woman. "Brenda's gone too far. Ducks indeed. They've been on that lake for decades. And children laughing? What kind of monster finds laughter? She's losing her mind, and half the community knows it." Her words, though quiet, offered a small measure of comfort. The next few days were a blur of intense legal strategizing. David and Sarah Davies, his lawyer, meticulously dissected Brenda's latest threats. "This excessive noise and unapproved wildlife claim is a stretch, Mr. Peterson," Sarah stated, tapping a pen against the offending document, "especially given your property ownership. But Brenda is clearly pushing the boundaries of what the HOA can legally enforce. She's banking on making this so financially draining and socially uncomfortable that you'll cave." I won't cave, David replied, his voice firm. But I don't want to spend the rest of my retirement fighting endless lawsuits over ducks. Sarah nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. Exactly. We need a strategy that not only defends you, but also fundamentally shifts the power dynamic. We can argue these fines are baseless and harassment, but that still means legal fees and a prolonged fight. Brenda wants to make this painful. We need to make it unwinnable for her. They explored various legal avenues. They looked at the specifics of the noise ordinance, finding it vague and subjective, making it difficult to prove or disprove. They researched local wildlife ordinances, confirming that ducks on a private lake were not a legal nuisance unless they posed an actual, documented health threat, which was unlikely. Sarah suggested they prepare a countersuit for harassment, a move that would put Brenda and the HOA on the defensive, forcing them to spend their own money to defend their actions. David also began to gather his own evidence. He installed discreet outdoor cameras facing the lake, not to spy, but to document the actual noise levels and the presence of wildlife. He wanted objective proof that the lake was not a raucous, animal-infested hazard, but rather a peaceful, well-maintained space. He also began keeping a detailed log of every interaction with Brenda or her proxies, every official-looking notice, every veiled threat. Meanwhile, Brenda launched her campaign of targeted harassment. David started receiving official-looking citations in his mailbox, almost daily. Noise violation. Recorded laughter at 3:17 p.m., fine $100. Wildlife nuisance. Excessive duck presence, 9:00 a.m., fine $250. Unauthorized recreational activity causing disturbance. Children splashing at 4 p.m., fine $150. Each citation was accompanied by a new, blurry photo, sometimes of children, sometimes just of the lake's surface. The fines rapidly accumulated, totaling thousands of dollars within days. It was a clear, coordinated effort to bleed him dry. David, following Sarah's advice, did not pay a single fine. He simply forwarded each one to her. Sarah compiled them, building a formidable case for harassment and abuse of power. She sent a stern letter to the HOA's legal counsel, outlining their intent to countersue, not just the HOA, but potentially Brenda personally, for defamation and malicious prosecution. This put a small dent in Brenda's relentless attack, as the HOA's lawyers, more cautious than Brenda, advised a slight pause. They were obligated to represent the HOA's interests, not just Brenda's vendetta. The tension in the community thickened. Residents started avoiding David's gaze or whispering when he walked past. Some of Brenda's staunchest allies would conspicuously turn their backs when he approached. He felt the cold shoulder, the subtle ostracization. It wasn't a loud, angry confrontation, but a quiet, chilling social pressure designed to make him feel unwelcome, to isolate him. He understood this tactic too. Brenda was trying to make him feel like an outcast, hoping he would simply give up and leave. He knew that for some, the fear of HOA retribution was very real. One evening, as David was reading by his living room window, he noticed a young boy, perhaps Lily's age, standing at the very edge of his property line, peering towards the lake with a wistful expression. The boy seemed hesitant, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds, as if expecting someone to appear and scold him. He had a small, plastic toy boat in his hands, but he didn't dare launch it. David's heart ached. This was the effect of Brenda's fear-mongering. Children were now afraid to even look at the lake. He knew he had to do something beyond just legal defense. He needed to show the community, not just tell them, that the lake was a place of joy, not fear. He remembered the promises he had made at the meeting: safety signs, life preservers, fishing clinics. He decided to act on them, not just as a legal defense, but as a statement of his true intentions. He ordered bright, clear signs. Willow Creek Lake, private property, enjoy responsibly. Please respect wildlife, no swimming. He also ordered a series of emergency life preserver stations, brightly colored and easily visible, to be installed at key points around the lake, complete with clear instructions. He wanted to make the lake undeniably safe, undeniably welcoming, within reasonable boundaries. This was his way of countering Brenda's fear with care. His actions, however, were not without immediate repercussions. The moment he started installing the signs, 2 HOA members, clearly dispatched by Brenda, showed up, taking photos and muttering about unapproved signage and alterations to community aesthetics. David simply smiled, handed them a copy of his deed, and calmly informed them that the lake and its immediate shoreline, where the signs were placed, were his private property and not subject to HOA aesthetic rules. Their faces fell, their cameras clicking furiously, but they couldn't stop him. A few days later, a new, more aggressive round of fines appeared in David's mailbox. This time, they weren't just for noise or ducks. They were for unapproved structures, referring to the life preserver stations, and unauthorized earth disturbance, for the small holes he'd dug to plant the signposts. Brenda was clearly escalating, throwing everything she could at him, hoping something would stick. It was a desperate, unhinged attack, but it was relentless. The fines began to exceed what felt like a reasonable amount, reaching into thousands of dollars each week. David's lawyer assured him they would be thrown out in court, but the sheer volume was designed to overwhelm him, to make him feel like he was drowning in paper. He knew Brenda was closely monitoring his actions, waiting for any misstep, any sign of weakness. Then, one particularly warm evening, David received a very different kind of notice. It wasn't from the HOA. It was a formal letter from a local environmental protection agency marked Urgent Environmental Investigation. The letter stated they had received an anonymous complaint about potential environmental contamination and disruption of natural habitat at Willow Creek Lake, citing concerns about excessive fish feeding, unauthorized introduction of non-native species, ducks, and general mismanagement of a sensitive ecological area. The letter requested a full inspection of the lake and its surrounding property within 72 hours, with the explicit threat of legal action and severe fines if they found any violations. David felt a cold dread settle over him. This was a direct, targeted attack on his ownership, designed to revoke his rights or burden him with impossible remediation costs. Brenda wasn't just going after his wallet or his peace. She was trying to weaponize environmental regulations against him. This was far beyond petty HOA disputes. This was a serious, potentially devastating challenge to his ownership, aimed at stripping him of his private oasis. He knew, instinctively, who was behind the anonymous complaint. Brenda, relentless and vengeful, had just upped the ante in a way he hadn't fully anticipated. He looked at the stark words on the page, the official seal of the environmental agency, and knew that his biggest fight was just beginning. The environmental investigation notice felt like a physical blow, colder and more calculated than any of Brenda's previous attacks. This was a direct strike at the very heart of David's ownership, threatening not just fines, but the possibility of being forced to completely alter or even relinquish control of his lake. He knew Brenda was behind it. The anonymous complaint was her vengeful handiwork, a desperate attempt to leverage outside authority when her HOA powers proved insufficient. He stared at the official seal, the cold, stark language, and felt a surge of grim determination. He wouldn't let her destroy the peace and potential of Willow Creek Lake. He immediately called Sarah Davies, his lawyer, her voice sounding calm but serious as he explained the new development. "This is a different beast, Mr. Peterson," she stated. "Environmental agencies don't mess around. We need to be fully prepared. They'll be looking for any actual violations, but Brenda's aim here is clearly to create such a regulatory nightmare that you'll be forced to give up. We need to be proactive, not just reactive." Sarah advised him to immediately engage an environmental consultant, someone who could independently assess the lake's health, document his responsible practices, and counter any false claims Brenda might have made. Within hours, David had secured the services of Dr. Evelyn Reed, a respected environmental scientist with a no-nonsense demeanor and a deep understanding of aquatic ecosystems. Dr. Reed arrived the very next day, equipped with specialized gear, taking water samples, observing the wildlife, and thoroughly inspecting the entire lake area. David spent the day with her, explaining his vision for the lake, his efforts to ensure safety, and his quiet joy in seeing children finally able to enjoy the water. Dr. Reed, after her initial assessment, offered a reassuring but cautious report. "The lake is healthy, Mr. Peterson," she confirmed. "No signs of unusual contamination or ecological distress. The ducks are a natural part of the ecosystem, and occasional feeding by humans is not causing any significant issues. The claims of unauthorized introduction of non-native species are absurd. These are common waterfowl. However, the agency will still conduct their full inspection. Our job is to provide them with undeniable proof of responsible management and preempt any manufactured issues." The day of the Environmental Agency's inspection arrived, thick with tension. Two officials, stern-faced and methodical, arrived in a marked vehicle. Brenda and her two loyal companions, Carol and Nancy, were conspicuously present, observing from a distance, their faces etched with smug anticipation. They held notebooks, occasionally pointing and whispering amongst themselves, clearly hoping to witness David's downfall. David, accompanied by Dr. Reed and Sarah Davies, greeted the officials calmly, offering full cooperation. The inspection was thorough, taking several hours. The officials meticulously tested water samples, measured turbidity, inspected the shoreline for any signs of pollution, and documented the wildlife. Dr. Reed presented her own findings, complete with detailed scientific data and observations, systematically dismantling each of Brenda's anonymous claims. She explained the natural ecosystem of the lake, the role of waterfowl, and confirmed David's responsible management practices. David, for his part, patiently answered every question, providing clear, factual information about his safety measures and his intentions for the lake. As the officials concluded their inspection, their expressions remained neutral, offering no immediate judgment. "We will compile our report and be in touch, Mr. Peterson," one of the officials stated, their voice devoid of emotion. "Thank you for your cooperation." They packed up their equipment and left, leaving David, Sarah, and Dr. Reed standing by the lake while Brenda watched, her face a mask of disappointment. The immediate threat had passed, but the uncertainty lingered. Brenda's gambit had not resulted in a dramatic collapse, but the silence from the agency was unnerving. In the days that followed, David resumed his routine, but with a heightened sense of vigilance. He continued to ignore Brenda's relentless fines, which still arrived daily, now piling up in a designated folder for Sarah. He maintained the lake meticulously, ensuring every safety sign was visible, every life preserver in place. He wanted no legitimate reason for Brenda to attack, no sliver of truth to her malicious claims. The community, too, was in a state of quiet anticipation. Everyone knew about the environmental inspection. People looked at David with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, wondering if his defiance would finally crumble under the weight of external pressure. A few residents, bolder than others, began to approach him, cautiously asking about the inspection, expressing their quiet support. Clara, his elderly neighbor, brought him a fresh batch of cookies, her way of showing solidarity. "Don't you worry, dear," she'd said. "Truth always finds its way out, no matter how many layers of nonsense Brenda tries to pile on." Then, about a week later, the official report from the Environmental Agency arrived. David opened it with a nervous breath. The report was concise and clear. It stated that their investigation found no evidence of environmental contamination or ecological mismanagement. It dismissed the claims of unauthorized introduction of non-native species as unfounded, confirming the presence of common, naturally occurring waterfowl. It concluded by stating that Willow Creek Lake was, at the time of inspection, in good ecological health, and that Mr. Peterson, as the property owner, was managing it responsibly. It recommended no further action and closed the case. A wave of profound relief washed over David. He immediately sent a copy to Sarah, who called him back moments later, her voice filled with unconcealed satisfaction. "Excellent, Mr. Peterson. This is a major victory. It completely undermines Brenda's environmental claims. We can now add this to our countersuit as further evidence of her malicious intent." Brenda, however, was not one to admit defeat, even in the face of irrefutable evidence. The news of the environmental report spread rapidly through the community, a quiet hum of affirmation for David. Many residents saw it as clear proof of Brenda's overreach, a sign that she was acting out of personal vendetta rather than genuine concern. This loss, so public and so definitive, further chipped away at her authority. She called another emergency HOA meeting, her voice tight with suppressed rage, but this time the attendance was noticeably thinner. Some residents simply refused to show up, a silent act of defiance against her relentless drama. At the meeting, Brenda tried to downplay the environmental report, dismissing it as incomplete or biased. She insisted that the attractive nuisance and noise issues still stood, attempting to pivot back to her earlier arguments, but her usual fire seemed to dim, her voice lacking its customary conviction. She spoke of escalating legal action, but the threats now sounded hollow, the weight of her previous failures hanging heavy in the air. The other board members, weary of the constant legal battles and the growing community dissatisfaction, looked increasingly uncomfortable. They wanted to find a way out, a path to peace. The meeting ended without any clear resolution, only more vague threats from Brenda. David left feeling cautiously optimistic. He had survived the environmental assault, and Brenda's hold on the community was visibly weakening. He was winning the larger battle for hearts and minds. He knew she wouldn't give up, but her options were dwindling. The immediate danger had passed, and a quiet sense of calm began to settle over his days once more. He continued to enjoy his lake, to wave at neighbors, to offer a friendly smile to the children, who now, more boldly, ventured near the shore, their laughter echoing softly across the water. This period of relative calm, however, proved to be short-lived. Brenda was not simply defeated. She was cornered, and a cornered animal is often the most dangerous. Her public failures had chipped away at her image, eroding the fear she once commanded. She needed a dramatic, undeniable victory, something that would restore her dominance and punish David in a way he couldn't easily counter. David, enjoying a quiet afternoon by the lake, watching a family of ducks glide gracefully across the water, heard a distant, unfamiliar rumble. It grew steadily louder, a deep, mechanical roar that seemed utterly out of place in the peaceful community. He stood up, his brow furrowed, trying to pinpoint the source. The rumble became a grinding clang, then the unmistakable groan of heavy machinery. It sounded like something big, something industrial, was approaching. He walked quickly to the edge of his property, peering through the trees towards the main road that bordered Willow Creek. What he saw sent a cold shock through him, a jolt of disbelief that made his heart pound against his ribs. A convoy of massive vehicles, dwarfing the normal residential cars, was slowly making its way down the street. It wasn't a construction crew or a utility company. Leading the procession was a huge, earth-moving excavator, its massive shovel arm swaying ominously. Behind it followed dump trucks, their empty beds ready for heavy loads, and other specialized equipment. And at the front of the convoy, walking with a grim, determined stride, was Brenda. She wasn't alone. With her were several stern-looking men in uniforms that David didn't recognize, and one man holding a roll of blueprints, pointing at the road. Brenda looked directly at David, her face grim, her eyes burning with a chilling, triumphant fire that sent a shiver down his spine. She lifted a megaphone to her lips, her voice booming across the quiet neighborhood, distorted and echoing. "Attention, residents of Willow Creek, and Mr. Peterson," she announced, her voice filled with a terrifying glee. "The HOA, with the unanimous consent of the board and full legal authorization, is commencing Phase 1 of a critical community infrastructure project. For the safety and future of Willow Creek, and to mitigate all potential attractive nuisances, we are commencing the construction of a permanent, 8-foot-high, reinforced concrete privacy wall around the entire perimeter of Willow Creek Lake." David stared, utterly aghast, as the massive excavator slowly rumbled to a stop directly at the edge of the public road, right where his lake property began. The man with the blueprints unrolled them, pointing to a stark, thick line that encircled the entire lake, a clear demarcation for the imposing wall. Brenda's voice, amplified by the megaphone, continued to echo, now laced with a triumphant, undeniable finality. "This wall will ensure the privacy and safety of our residents, separating our community from all unauthorized access and all unapproved activity from the lake. Work begins now. And Mr. Peterson, any interference will be considered a serious legal offense." The roar of the excavator's engine suddenly intensified, its massive arm beginning to move, lowering its metal shovel towards the earth. David felt a cold dread wash over him. An 8-foot concrete wall around his entire lake. Brenda wasn't just trying to fine him, she was trying to physically cut him off, to make his beautiful shared oasis into an inaccessible, isolated prison, all to reassert her ultimate control. This was an extreme, unprecedented act of aggression, a physical manifestation of her relentless vendetta, and David knew with chilling certainty that this was the biggest challenge he had ever faced. The thunderous roar of the excavator's engine vibrated through the air, shaking the very ground beneath David's feet. Its enormous metal arm, poised like a menacing giant, began to bite into the earth at the edge of the road, directly in front of his lake property. Dust billowed, and the ominous clank of machinery filled the once peaceful evening. Brenda stood beside the foreman, her face a mask of triumphant vindication, her eyes fixed on David with a chilling glare that conveyed absolute victory. An 8-foot concrete wall around his entire lake. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an act of utter aggression designed to render his beloved property useless, to physically sever his connection to the water, and to send an undeniable message of who truly held power in Willow Creek. Panic, cold and sharp, briefly pierced through David's calm resolve. This was unprecedented. A physical barrier, erected without his consent, blocking his access and the community's enjoyment of his lake. He watched as the first section of earth was torn from the ground, the raw, exposed soil a brutal contrast to the manicured lawns of the neighborhood. He saw the dump trucks begin to back into position, ready to haul away the displaced earth, preparing for the concrete pour. He knew he had to act, and fast. He pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the keypad, calling Sarah Davies. Her voice, when she answered, was brisk. "Mr. Peterson, what's happening?" "Brenda's building a wall," David said, his voice tight with urgency, the roar of the machinery almost drowning him out. "A concrete wall. Around the entire lake. They're starting now. Heavy machinery, construction crews, everything." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "A wall?" Sarah's voice rose in disbelief. That's an extreme escalation, completely illegal. She has no right to build on or block access to your private property. This is trespass, obstruction, and a clear act of malicious intent. I'm coming over immediately. Do not, under any circumstances, interfere with them physically. Just document everything. I'll be there as fast as I can." David took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He grabbed his phone and started recording, capturing the roaring machinery, the massive shovel, and Brenda's triumphant stance. He filmed the construction crew, the survey markers, the sheer scale of the operation that Brenda had somehow orchestrated. He saw confused and concerned neighbors emerging from their homes, drawn by the unsettling noise, their faces reflecting his own disbelief. Clara, standing on her porch, covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with shock. The crew worked with shocking speed, clearly having prepared meticulously. By the time Sarah's car pulled up, tires squealing slightly as she parked hastily, a significant trench had already been dug along a section of the road bordering David's property. Concrete trucks were beginning to arrive, their drums slowly turning. Sarah jumped out of her car, her face grim. She quickly assessed the situation, her eyes narrowing as she saw Brenda overseeing the operation with an air of absolute command. Sarah immediately approached the foreman, a burly man with a no-nonsense expression. "I'm Sarah Davies, legal counsel for Mr. David Peterson, the owner of Willow Creek Lake," she stated, her voice firm, holding up her identification. "This construction is occurring on or adjacent to private property without permission and is a clear violation of property rights. I demand you cease all operations immediately." The foreman, however, merely grunted. "Got our permits, ma'am. This is a critical infrastructure project for Willow Creek HOA. We're authorized to proceed. Any interference will result in legal action." He gestured vaguely towards a laminated permit posted on a nearby utility pole, but it was too far away to read clearly. Brenda, observing the exchange, stepped forward, a smug smile spreading across her face. "Miss Davies," she purred, her voice dripping with false civility. "So glad you could make it. As the foreman said, we are fully authorized. This wall is being built on HOA common property adjacent to the public road. It is for the safety and security of Willow Creek residents to protect them from external nuisances. Your client's lake remains his. We are simply ensuring proper separation." Her eyes glittered with malicious triumph. "You'll find the plans and permits are all in order. We've been planning this for months, quietly, of course, for efficiency." David felt a cold dread. "Common property?" he questioned, stepping forward. "That's directly on the boundary of my lake." "The plans show a clear easement, Mr. Peterson," Brenda declared, her voice rising in volume. "A boundary adjustment, for community safety, approved by the county planning department. It's all perfectly legal. You have no claim on our community's land." Sarah's face tightened. "An easement? What easement? This is ridiculous. We will get an immediate injunction." "You try that, Ms. Davies," Brenda scoffed, a sneer on her face. "But by the time your legal teams get their paperwork in order, this wall will be well on its way, and good luck getting a judge to stop a community safety project. We have the homeowner's well-being at stake. You're simply trying to protect your client's unapproved recreational activities." She turned her back, signaling to the foreman. The excavator's engine roared again, and its shovel began to move, digging further into the earth, closer and closer to David's lake property line. The sound of the heavy machinery continued through the night, a relentless assault on the peaceful quiet of Willow Creek. David couldn't sleep. He watched from his window as floodlights illuminated the construction site, the figures of the workers moving like silent, determined ants. He felt a profound sense of helplessness. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a physical act of aggression, a tangible barrier that would cut off the very thing he had fought so hard to protect. He imagined the wall rising, tall and gray, casting a permanent shadow over the lake, turning it into a hidden, unreachable expanse. The next morning, the reality was even more stark. A significant section of the trench had been dug, deep and wide, and the first concrete foundations were already being poured. The air was thick with the smell of wet concrete and disturbed earth. The scene was devastating. David felt a wave of despair wash over him. Brenda had truly gone all out, leveraging every connection, exploiting every loophole, to build this wall. This wasn't just about winning, it was about humiliation, about demonstrating her absolute power. He met Sarah at his house later that morning, her eyes tired but determined. "Brenda pulled a fast one, Mr. Peterson," she admitted, rubbing her temples. She used an obscure emergency safety declaration provision in the county codes. It allows for expedited permits for projects deemed critical to public safety, and she somehow managed to convince the county planning department that an 8-foot concrete wall around the lake was just that. It's technically on an obscure strip of land that Brenda's easement claims fall under HOA jurisdiction, even though it skirts your property line. It's a very aggressive, very expensive, and frankly, very unusual move for an HOA. This is going to be a tough fight to stop immediately. "So she wins?" David asked, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. Sarah shook her head. "Not if we can help it. We're filing for an emergency injunction, but it's a long shot given the safety angle. What Brenda is doing is malicious, but she's cloaked it in legal jargon. We need to find a way to make her stop, to make this project economically unfeasible, or prove it's not actually for safety." David spent the next few days in a haze of phone calls, legal discussions, and watching the relentless progress of the wall. Each new segment of concrete that rose from the ground was a punch to his gut. He felt the joy of his lake slipping away, replaced by a sense of loss and anger. He saw children peering sadly from their yards, the promise of fishing now replaced by the grim reality of a looming concrete barrier. He even saw Clara, her face drawn, watching the construction with a look of profound sadness. Brenda's tactics were working. The community was divided, some terrified by her power, others quietly seething, but all seemingly helpless. Then, one evening, as David sat by his window, staring at the growing wall, a thought sparked in his mind. An idea so audacious, so ridiculous, yet so perfectly in line with his original act of buying the lake, that he almost laughed out loud. It was a long shot, a desperate measure, but it was the only way to truly reclaim his lake and expose Brenda's tyranny for what it was. It involved pushing Brenda's own legal interpretation of community safety to its absolute limit, turning her greatest weapon against her. He immediately called Sarah. "Sarah, I have an idea," he began, his voice low and excited. "It's crazy, but it might just work. If Brenda is so concerned about community safety and the lake being an attractive nuisance, and if she's willing to spend a fortune on a wall, what if I removed the nuisance entirely? What if I made it not a lake anymore?" There was a pause on the other end. "Mr. Peterson, what are you talking about?" Sarah's voice was cautious. "If Brenda wants to protect Willow Creek from my lake so badly," David continued, his voice gaining momentum, "then I'll help her. I own the lake bed, right? The water is just sitting on my property. What if I remove the water? What if I drain Willow Creek Lake?" Sarah was silent for a long moment. Then a slow, disbelieving gasp escaped her lips. "Drain the lake? Mr. Peterson, that's an enormous undertaking. The environmental impact, the cost, the public outcry." "But it's my property," David insisted, his mind already racing with the implications. "And if Brenda is arguing that the lake itself is a safety hazard, an attractive nuisance that requires an 8-foot concrete wall, then removing the water would solve her problem, wouldn't it? No water, no drowning risk, no fish, no unapproved wildlife, no splashing, no excessive noise. It would eliminate every single one of her concerns, and it would make her very expensive wall utterly pointless." Sarah let out a shaky laugh, a mix of disbelief and dawning realization. "Mr. Peterson, that's either sheer madness or absolute genius. It would certainly make her wall redundant, and it would be the ultimate act of, well, property rights, but the logistical and legal hurdles would be immense, and the community reaction—" "The community," David cut in, "would see Brenda for what she truly is. She wants to wall off the lake? Fine. I'll drain it. Let her build her monument to fear and control around an empty pit." This isn't about spite, Sarah. This is about showing them the absurdity of her power, about making a stand that no amount of legal maneuvering or concrete can hide. This is about reclaiming the spirit of Willow Creek. Sarah was quiet for a while longer, considering the monumental implications. "It would certainly stop the wall," she finally said, a new resolve in her voice. "And it would expose Brenda's true intentions to everyone. But it's an extreme measure, Mr. Peterson. Are you sure you're willing to go that far?" David looked out at the relentless progress of the wall, the dull concrete rising higher and higher, threatening to engulf his quiet oasis. He thought of the terrified boy, Lily's hopeful eyes, and Clara's sad gaze. He thought of all the years Brenda had wielded her petty power, crushing joy and common sense. He thought of the beautiful, shimmering lake slowly being choked by a monument to fear. "I'm sure, Sarah," David replied, his voice calm, resolute, and utterly determined. "If she wants to cut off the lake from Willow Creek, then there won't be a lake to cut off. Let her build her wall around an empty hole. We'll show her what true nuisance looks like." He hung up the phone, a cold, hard plan forming in his mind, knowing that the next few days would bring the most extreme confrontation Willow Creek had ever seen.